All right. More than a few of us have wondered, what happened to my Seattle? We're about to get the answers now. I'm going to introduce, you know him well, Greg Hanscom, executive editor for KCTS 9, and Crosscut is going to moderate our panel, and I'll let Greg introduce the panel as well. Please give them a warm Seattle 4 welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks, everyone. Thank you to the folks at the Hyatt for a fabulous lunch. I was at the dentist this morning, and as the needles came out to pump my face full of Novocaine, I said, "When is that going to wear off?" And she said, "Well, it usually takes an hour or two, but every once in a while, somebody's face just goes numb all day." I'm really happy to report that my face just started getting peeling back. And I'm pretty sure it was because of that fabulous lunch. Thank you. So we are here today to talk about our Seattle, to talk about our changing community. I think a lot of us, whether we are lifelong Seattleites or newer arrivals, have found ourselves looking around in recent months wondering, what the heck has happened to this place? The traffic is insane. The real estate prices are mind-blowing. The tenor of the political discussion has gone suddenly very sour. We watched the sort of explosion of activity around the head tax, and I think a lot of us wondered, what happened to the good old Seattle that I knew, where people could talk to one another, have civil conversations, find common ground, and solutions to the issues that we face as a community. So here to talk about these issues, we've got two folks. It would be hard to find two who are better qualified for this particular conversation. To my right is Mónica Guzmán. Mónica is a longtime columnist in town. You may have read her work in the Seattle PI back in the day, or the Seattle Times, or GeekWire. She most recently is co-founder and editor of the Evergrey. Any Evergrey subscribers in this room? Okay, we got a few. All right, when you go home, get on the web, look up the Evergrey, gray with an E, it's fancy like that, and subscribe to the daily email newsletter. It's a great sort of window into what is happening in this community every day. And to Monica's right, we have Skip. Knute Berger is his real name. We all call him Skip.
So much easier than Knute.
Knute, because you have to pronounce the K.
Right.
And you have to pronounce the G, J. It's very confusing. Skip, stick with Skip. Skip has been, he's been in the journalism business in this community for a very long time. He was at East Side Week back in the day when there was an East Side Weekly newspaper to go along with Seattle Weekly. He later was editor at Seattle Weekly and was one of the founding members of the staff at Crosscut. And has been writing the Mossback column for Crosscut for the past 10, now almost 11 years. 11 years. You can get Crosscut in your inbox every day too, just so you know. I thought I might start, Skip, by asking you, as a lifelong Seattleite, what's happened to your Seattle? What are you seeing going on right now, and what makes this particular moment in time unique?
Well, how many, I'd like to know how many folks here are Seattle natives. Wow. Oh, that's, I think percentage-wise we're down to what, maybe 20%, 17%, something like that of the total in Seattle, maybe less. So a lot of you have seen the changes that I've seen. I grew up in the Rainier Valley in the 1950s and 60s. And, it was still largely a kind of an Italian and a Catholic white working class neighborhood, diversified dramatically in the 60s and 70s. I went through the Boeing recession. We had a neighbor who was worked at Boeing who became our paper boy. It was that kind of a time in Seattle. And a lot of people in Seattle have never seen that dip. The time when Seattle lost population, time when, at the real estate prices, you could buy a house for $17,000. So, when I look at my Seattle, I see this continuum that goes from not only my childhood, but my father's childhood and my grandfather. And, I think this is an unprecedented period. It's an unprecedented period in terms of growth. I think it's an unprecedented period in terms of a huge class shift in Seattle. In the sense that we used to be, like back in the 90s, we were still the most middle-class city in America. We had the largest number of middle-class residents for an urban city. We had the large percentage of home ownership in all communities. And so we're seeing this, this urban shift, and a lot of the changes that I see, they're positive ones. We're a more diverse city than we were. I think that's great. We're a city with a ton of resources that we didn't used to have. And, but if you want to drive anywhere or walk anywhere, it's a pain in the butt. It almost feels sometimes like living in Seattle is, you're punished for living in Seattle. You're punished if you want to get anywhere. You're punished if you want to buy a house. You're punished if you speak your mind. In some ways, I think our political discourse is starting to reflect the national discourse in terms of divisiveness. And I saw this emerging actually back in the late 90s and early 2000s, where it wasn't enough to be liberal and progressive. There were a whole bunch of kind of rules that went along with what you had to believe, and I think that's culminating now in terms of some of the conflicts at the city council.
So, Monica, your Seattle is a little newer. Tell us a little bit about sort of when you arrived and your experience. You've been here about 10 years, is this?
Yeah, it's been 11 years. And when I got here, South Lake Union was a sleepy part of the city. Belltown was kind of the hip nightlife sort of thing. It was sort of rising. Everything seemed a lot more affordable for sure. But I think what's been happening as you look around is frankly an identity crisis. I think Seattle has these really strong values in which it takes a lot of pride, and we're not really sure altogether how to apply them correctly, right? I used to tell people when I told them why I did fall in love with the city, I met my husband here, we have our 2 kids, like I'm home, this is it. And when they ask me why do you love Seattle, one of my favorite things to say is that when the people of Seattle are presented with evidence that they are not doing right by each other, I think they really step up and try to do something about it. So often I think you'll see a lot of guilt and sort of, a little bit of panic when parts of Seattle think, oh no, wait, we've got this enormous homeless population. What is happening with that? And we've got the gentrification of the Central District and other communities that have completely transformed from what they used to be. Just basically destabilized communities, I think, across our city, and it does reflect what's happening nationally, absolutely. And I think a lot of the destabilization was tied to the presidential election. Seattle, I believe only 2 cities had more voters who didn't vote for Trump than Seattle, Detroit and Washington, D.C. So this is just a place that really got anxious and provoked, and then we looked around and we saw the problems, and so that has led us to where we are politically, where supposedly there's Seattle nice, and we're all kind of decent and often passive aggressive. But who saw that video Como put up of the Ballard church meeting around the head tax? Because whoa, right? There was an explosion there, and when I saw, so to give you all some context, Councilmember Michael Bryan was there, and there were camps around the head tax that showed up. But what was truly stunning was the tenor of that debate, and it seemed to be some display of how much more difficult it has become to listen to each other, how people in Seattle who have different lifestyles, different life experiences, different values and different political leanings, we're drifting pretty far apart. And as a journalist and someone who likes to see people come together and try to make solutions. I'm certainly concerned about that. So I think my Seattle is one that is very divided right now, but that still, when presented with evidence that we're not doing right by each other, wants to lean in and fix it. In fact, some people I've talked to are really excited about this is the laboratory, this is the place. This is the place with the smartest people, this is the place with the most compassionate, culture. We've got some issues, communication issues, some other things, but we can figure them out. We're gonna stay in the arena and figure them out.
I was really struck recently. Crosscut got a hold of some polling data that suggests that people in Seattle have become fed up, or they've lost their patience in government spending on the homeless crisis. Essentially, we've peaked out and decided that we continue to throw money at this problem year after year after year. Fewer and fewer people are actually confident that the government is going to be able to do anything with that money, or that the government is spending that money wisely. And to either of you, has Seattle sort of reached the limits of its progressive politics?
Well, I'm not sure if it's reached the limits, but it may be narrowing some of the definition a little bit. If you look at some of the controversy over the head tax, one of the things, it was framed as a tax to basically punish or get Amazon to pay its fair share to compensate for damage that Amazon is blamed by some for. In terms of what's happened with how income is distributed in Seattle. The thing that I thought was really interesting about that was that there's a lot of anger among working class Seattle. The people that Kshama Sawant purports to represent, yet that head tax, while Amazon probably could afford that money, there are all these businesses. There were 500 businesses in Seattle, smaller businesses that were going to be dramatically affected by that tax. And some of these are companies that have been here for over 100 years. Merlinos, Uwajimaya, and there was no thought given to that part of the fabric of the city. It was all Amazon, make them pay. I also have been doing, some stories in Ballard, in the fishing community and whatnot. And, I think that Mike O'Brien, one of the city council members, was sort of famously given the bum's rush at a Nordic Heritage Museum party by one of the shipyard owners who was fed up with his council representative and threw him out. Regardless of what you think about the classiness of bodily throwing out the city council member from a function, the worry in Ballard has an industrial area. It's, and they see developers and urbanists trying to convert these properties into mixed-use, high-rise, high-tech developments. And, this is the home of the North Pacific fishing fleet. This is multi-billion-dollar industry. They're struggling already with what's happening in the climate and the oceans and the markets and the lack of fish in the sea. And then suddenly somebody purports to represent their interests is more interested in, seeing a new brewery and apartments going in. On a place that's going to affect the shipyard business and all the businesses associated with that. So I think part of the dissatisfaction actually is an economic one that goes to whose economic interests are being served. And it's not industrial Seattle, it's not maritime Seattle, but these things are overlooked as not being important anymore.
So Mónica, I think of the Evergrey as kind of a guide to Seattle and the region for people who have arrived more recently, young people, new arrivals. What do you hear from the Evergrey's audience about what's happening in the city right now and what they see going forward?
All kinds of things. Definitely have heard from newer Amazon employees who are conscious of the stigma on day one, that there's a lot being placed on their shoulders and they had nothing to do with it. They're part of a company that, we can debate culpability or obligation, right, of a large company that has brought a ton of economic boon to a city and has made some, worried that it's not doing its fair share as a civic citizen. That's another debate. But I've heard from those folks who are here and they're part of the tech industry, and they just want to have a good time. A lot of them. They want to enjoy Seattle. They want to get invested. For some, maybe Seattle is kind of a stop on the road to somewhere else, and that's fine. It feels like, generally young people should be allowed to do that, right? Like young people in their 20s, most of the time we're exploring our options. We're trying to kind of float around. But a lot of newcomers here are more high income, and a majority of them are in the millennial range. There's, I think, 45,000 newcomers to Seattle per year, each year from 2012 to 2016. 90% of them were not tech, by the way, but 10% of them were, and that's actually pretty big. I think Gene Balk of the Seattle Times said it was 50 developers a week, 50 software developers a week moving here in 2016. So it's interesting for me as well, because I remember several years ago, the tech industry and the creative industry and creative flavor of Seattle. That's another thing I love about Seattle is we are creative. Like we don't follow conventions and old rules. Like we invent. We're new. We're future forward. Right. We're thinking about what's ahead. But I think you're getting to this place where the tech industry is actually not the hero right now for a lot of folks. And for some, it's actually the problem. And why is it the problem? Well, I think for those folks, you have to come back to the fact that we're in an anxious period. And what do people do when they're anxious? They tend to kind of close in a little bit. I think you're seeing a lot of people identify with certain communities, certain parts of who they are, and surround themselves with those viewpoints, which we all know. I mean, that's the echo chamber effect. It makes you feel good, but what does it do to a city? And I think we're seeing what it does to a city. People are scared. They're taking shortcuts as far as, things that could be really nuanced and involved debates often end with, no, business is bad, we're done. No, growth is good or growth is bad. Or no, if that business can't survive in this neighborhood, then everything is wrong and let's revisit. So it's difficult in the discourse. I think it's very clear, for people to really make headway on that. Newcomers, I think, are conscious of it, and they're placed in a really strange spot where, again, they just, for those who are young, they just want to be young and explore a city and have their freedom and their options. And all of a sudden, they're being sort of told that, no, you're part of the problem. Look at all the ways the city's suffering because of you. And that's for some of them. But I will also say that they come with a ton of smarts and a lot of energy, those of them that are from the tech industry and kind of fit this mold. And a lot of them are trying to get in there and get their hands dirty and try to fix it, try to be part of the solution, which is great. So anyway, yeah, it's just, we have a lot of work to do.
So where do you two see the productive conversation? I mean, I think the rancor has been front and center, certainly in the news these recent weeks. Where do you see kind of the civil conversations? Where do you see people coming together and really working toward, solving some of these issues, continuing to make Seattle kind of that city of the future that we all sort of imagine and love?
Well, Seattle, I've always thought Seattle's had this yin-yang from the very beginning of our existence, where we've had very idealistic, almost utopian people who moved here who wanted to build a perfect community. Puget Sound area had tons of utopian communities. People saw this in the 1850s as a blank slate where you could come and do everything right. And we've also had, alongside that, people who were business-oriented. They came here to make a buck, and they came here to make money because of that blank slate. They could come, they could set up a sawmill, they could build whatever. And so there's this kind of dual part of, in Seattle, it's like a moral statement whether you have a plastic bag or a paper bag. I mean, everything we do is freighted with some kind of moral attachment to it. I think we've gone overboard on that side. We've gone too far away from the practical. We used to have city council members, who were really corrupt. We cleaned a lot of that up in the 60s and 70s, and then in more recent decades, we've had city councils that weren't particularly colorful, but we had people who were very engaged in the supervision of the city, looking, watchdogging city light, looking at budgets in detail, and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, I think our politics is taking us to this more divisive role where everybody has to out-left the other person. I go around the state and I tell people Seattle is a two-party town, It's Democrats and Trotskyites. Republicans, barely exist now here. And I'm old enough to remember when Republicans were the Reform Party in Seattle and helped clean it up. I think the discussion has to happen by the public insisting that the city council, and with civic groups like this, insisting on broad-minded, pragmatic discussion, problems solution-oriented as opposed to posturing. And I think that's tough given some of the political dynamics and the way hot button pushing works. But and groups like the Evergrey that convene people for positive discussion. We did a Crosscut festival at Seattle University where we brought people together of varying ideologies to talk about politics and that kind of thing. And I think there's a hunger across the political spectrum now for that kind of discussion, and I think we need to, as media outlets, look for opportunities to convene that.
Definitely. When you first asked the question, where are these things happening? I said, I don't know.
The Evergrey.
I don't know. Well, thank you, but I think it is fairly rare. I think of one example. Who's part of their Nextdoor community on social media, like Nextdoor? Okay, so Nextdoor, when you really think about it, I mean, it's new in the last several years, and what that platform is, by the way, is you live in a neighborhood and you can sign on to your own neighborhood's Nextdoor, which means that you can speak just to your own neighbors. Literally, someone who does not live in your neighborhood cannot see the conversations. And so now there's all these, I mean, what I'm hearing about what's happening in the Nextdoor area in Ballard around homelessness or other parts of the city, everyone's having their own separate conversations, and they're getting really intense and really deep, but they are invisible to folks who are not there. And I think you can take that model and spread it to a lot of the conversations in Seattle. And there's also, I will say economically, less of an interest among platforms or other online spaces at least, to build spaces where lots of communities mingle, because you can't as easily make money that way. The best way to build an audience is to narrowly define that audience. My outlet, my thing serves the Trotskyite whatever who lives wherever. And so you see that happening, very broadly socially, and the way that it impacts how Seattle communicates with itself is really interesting. Combined again with the anxiety that many of us are feeling, and Seattle is already naturally a very blue place. We're also a very smart place, but I do see us kind of constricting a little bit. So hopefully these spaces will get built because we need them.
So I want to loop all of you into this conversation and take some questions for these two from the audience, if I can. I think we've got some microphones, or I can hand mine off.
Okay, I'll start. First of all, thank you for being here. One of the things that concerns me is in 2015, about 30% of Seattleites voted. And as a result, we ended up with a city council like we have today. In 2019, 7 of them are up for election. How can we improve and increase voter participation during an off year when people typically have lost interest and, have kind of given up?
Well, at least now the government will pay for your stamp. You won't have to show. And I think a lot of young people have never seen a postage stamp. I found that with my kids and grandkids. It's like, what is that? So I think having it postpaid will help. we went to this district system, and this is the first time that all of the district seats are going to be up. The 2 at-large seats are not up, but the district seats are. And I think it's a really important election in terms of people making a statement about whether district politics are working or not. I think people expected a lot of the politics to become more parochial. Now, I can't go by my experience. I'm in Shama Sawant's district. I don't think I've seen her in Madison Park or Montlake or looking at potholes or anything like that. She has kind of a larger agenda, and I think that's also still happening with some of the other council members. They're thinking citywide, which is good, but I'm not sure they're attentive to their constituencies, and I think the Mike O'Brien debacle. So I think that talking about the nature of the city council and the nature of the districts and what's needed is going to be an important thing in motivating voters. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who don't vote regularly are only motivated by wedge issues. So I expect to see a lot of that.
There's no data around this, but the number of Seattle citizens who are getting engaged in some way has to be way up. I mean, there's so many rallies, there's so many events, there's so many discussions. People are really, really leaned in to Seattle right now, at least more than in the 11 years I've been here. That's all I can really speak to. But there's a sitting up and paying attention because so many of the issues do really have to do with just about everybody. Young people are very concerned about, oh yeah, in the regular course of life, I'm supposed to maybe think about buying a house at some point. Can I fall in love with the city of Seattle if I can't afford a house here? Should I even bother? How about I leave? Because it doesn't make sense. I've got too many friends who are making that, having that kind of conversation. So, yeah, I mean, that's just kind of where we are.
David Brenner has a question.
Just to follow up on your 2 answers, I was going to ask you about districts. Do you believe that the districts have exacerbated a divide between renters and property owners in Seattle, which seems to me to be quite strong these days and might contribute to the head tax issue, because property taxes have obviously increased greatly, and at the same time, there's a whole new cadre of people who don't pay those taxes directly.
Well, I think it is an issue because I think a lot of renters don't think that property tax affects them. Although it does affect their landlords, it's going to show up in their rent. So, but that might be too big of a leap for a lot of people to make. There definitely is a political divide, and it's a divide that's, I think, been wedgified between homeowners and everybody else. There's a sense that owning a single-family home is politically incorrect. That these neighborhoods are largely white and trying to buffer themselves from social change, from density, from being welcoming, and others. And so, I think Seattle's interesting in another way. I was up in Chelan and speaking to the Convention of State Planners. And one of the questions that was asked was, how many people here deal with NIMBYs? And everybody in this room like this, everybody raised their hand. They said, how many people deal with YIMBYs, the yes in my backyards? And there were like 3 people from Seattle that raised their hand. So, Seattle's kind of unique in that way, too, that there's a cadre of people who want, to promote equitable urban development. That's a very strong thing, but that's not widely felt throughout the region. And I think in Seattle, there is the real push-pull there between folks you're talking about. I don't think it's a district thing. I think it transcends that. But some districts have more renters than others.
Yeah, I think it's a very unfortunate divide. I can't speak to exactly what's exacerbating it, but it's also very natural. I think about life stages, right? If you rent in Seattle, you're more likely to be young, you're more likely to be new. If you own a home in Seattle, you're more likely to have been here a longer amount of time. You're more likely to feel invested in your neighborhood as it is, because maybe your kid's daycare is right over there and your coffee shop is right over there, and you like things to be the way they are. I don't think there's anything evil about lots of neighborhoods wanting to keep the lifestyle that they're invested in. But I also think there's nothing evil in people who might be renters, having more space in their lives to look around and to want to help other communities that are not their family or their friends or their neighborhood. And so I think that's what you're seeing. That's the nature of the clash, right? But it is a misunderstanding, and the vilification I see going back to both sides is just, it's beneath us, frankly. I really would like us to get over that, because it's getting to the point where some folks really just believe that, a homeowner who doesn't want to hike in property taxes hates the homeless. What? That's clearly not true. And vice versa, name your label on someone, a renter in Capitol Hill who goes to all the marches or whatever. Like, these polls are dangerous, and they're not accurate.
I'm next over here. She didn't want to introduce me. And you're going to find out why in a minute. I've like one of you, I've been in this city for over 60 years. Born and raised here, did my career here. I've seen a lot about what's happened to our city. And this permissive, accepting society and culture that we've had has been one of the great things about living in Seattle. And it's been known around the world, but around the country. But as we've grown now economically, we're getting challenged with that. And we're getting challenged to make some really tough decisions about things. And so, during my business career, I traveled all over the country. And you see other cities with growth issues that fight transportation and housing. And the one that's interesting to me is the homeless one. Because, I've watched this, the greatest solution for homelessness clearly is extremes in climate. I mean, if you got sub-zero weather, you're really going to have a low number of homeless. Check out Alaska. Very big in the summer, very small in the winter. So you don't get a lot of people living on the street. But in our society in the West Coast, there's a lot of cities that struggle with it. And I watched San Francisco. San Francisco had a huge homeless situation. And what was interesting about it, though, out of all the years that I went there, and I watched, at night, you just see the homeless appear out of nowhere, and they're asking you for money. But there were no tents. There was no camping. There was none of these cities that I was seeing. And yet we continually find solutions for homelessness. And because of our society and our culture, nobody really wants to have a tough discussion about it. Like, what are we going to do about homeless? And so, and you're gonna answer this, I can tell. So, oh, wrap it up. Oh, no, I'm enjoying the attention, Mark. Come on. You do this every night, every day, every week. You get it all the time. What's on the news tonight? So okay, thank you, Sergeant of Arms. So my question is, why can't we have a tough discussion about the homeless situation? Instead of taking care of the homeless, if we continue to grow, we're never going to get rid of the homeless. So what is the solution? The laws that need to be invoked, no camping in this city, vagrancy laws, all the things we don't want to talk about. Why? When are we going to start that discussion? And even you guys don't really want to get onto that, and I'm going to shut up now. Thanks.
Okay, so that is a great question, and I think we should take up that conversation after we're done up here on the stage. I also would point out that July 19th, the local media is getting together to spend an entire day focusing on the question of homelessness, the many faces of homelessness, and the many solutions that it will really require to address that issue. But we need to wrap it up right now, and I wanted to leave you all with one quick thought, and that is that the group Forterra, conservation group, local conservation group, put out a survey. This was about 1.5 years ago, I think. They surveyed millennials in Seattle, King County, and they asked them what it was that brought them and kept them here in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest. And the really striking thing about the results of that survey was that young people come here and stay here for the same reason that the rest of us do. They come here for the progressive politics. They come here for the amazing arts and culture scene. They come here for the easy access to the great outdoors. They come here because they want to be involved in the civic conversation, less on the national level, more on the local level. And they see Seattle as a place where the citizenry is engaged and involved in that conversation about building a better place. So if you have a chance to check out those numbers, you might do that. But I think what it suggested to me is that there really is an opportunity here for a conversation across these many divides that we've been talking about our common goals and our common vision for this place. People still come here because they think it could be a utopia. They think it could be the city that we've always dreamed of. And so I think our hope in the work that we do is that we can bring people together for those conversations. So thank you so much for letting us to have one of those conversations here. Thanks again for having us.